So what is the meaning of life? That's a pretty deep question. Let's dive right in. Every culture, probably every person that's lived long enough to really have much conscious thought, has asked the question, what am I here for? What is this all about? And James, that is a question that plagues many people because they don't even know where to begin to look to find the answer. But we know.
Yeah, we do. And it's pretty much laid out in Scripture. And it's birthed out of the recognition that there's a God, right? Because if you really believe there's a God and he created everything, then the next question is, well, what did he create us for? And I think the Scriptures, the Bible before us, does a great job in answering that question. And if I could sum it up in one word, it would be Jesus.
I know that as you study through the Methodist material, and that's what we're doing in kind of a loose knit series here, is we're going through a lot of the study materials that they provide. And this is one of the lessons. What is the meaning of life? And as they begin to ask and try to answer that question, they're always pointing back to Scripture. And there's one book in the Old Testament, the book of Ecclesiastes, that has both language that seems so empty and disheartening. And I'm going to read some of that. Futility of futilities, says the teacher. Futility of futilities. Everything is futile. What does a man gain from all of his labor that he toils under the sun for? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. The sun rises and it sets and it hurries back to where it rises. And then he just talks about everything is wearisome, more than you can even describe it. Your eye is not satisfied with seeing. Your ear is not content with hearing. What has been is what will always be. That's all from the first chapter of Ecclesiastes. And, that's a guy that's obviously pretty discouraged.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he had everything, didn't he?
Yeah, that's Solomon, of course.
Yeah, after reading, it's interesting, Ecclesiastes, that you bring that up, because after you read that book, it can kind of be discouraging. Because if you listen to the world that we live in and you say, what is the meaning of life from the world? It is acquiring of perhaps a legacy, a career, a house, a car, a family, a name, a reputation. The list goes on and on and on. And you read Ecclesiastes and it says, none of that matters. Not one item I just said matters.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, the whole book, it's an exercise in going through all of the things that he had either attained or been blessed with. And in the end, just saying it, in fact, he comes to the conclusion in the last chapter, just fear God and keep his commandments. That's about all there really is to it. But that's the whole point, isn't it? In Ecclesiastes, he goes through, hey, I assembled everything from great houses to wonderful gardens. I had all the pleasures you could have. I experienced love. I experienced entertainment. Everything I brought before me. And James, when people ask what's the meaning of life, you can tell by their actions where they're trying to find it. Some people try to find it in recreation, some in sports, some lose themselves in things that are totally disrelated to them. I think sports is a great example of that. I'm not talking about the guy that goes and plays softball. I'm talking about the guy that is a fanatic about some team, football, baseball, basketball, whatever it is, and somehow even deceives themselves into thinking that they're somehow part of this team. Yeah. And in reality, they're not at all. Yeah. And in all of the pursuits we have in life, don't you feel like it's kind of the same way? If you're not seeking meaning through God, you're going to end up completely dissatisfied and even deceived to the point that you imagine that you have some great success or you're part of something huge, when in reality, you're a couch potato.
Well, it's interesting because we do seek meaning out in things. And I think you have to be real careful and even evaluate why am I doing what I'm doing? People who obsess over sports or collecting, there's many people who, when they pass away, they go to the garages they've been renting out every month and they open them up and they find all this stuff that they don't know what to do with it, Right. But it's interesting how people try to find themselves in various things and distractions. I remember reading about Solomon when I was a kid. It's like, wow, he had everything and he had all those wives and all this. He was wealthy and all that stuff. And, in the world's perspective, King Solomon was like, wow, he had it really going on. And I'm so glad God used him to write Ecclesiastes, because God was not interested in holding up Solomon's example and say, look at this. Actually, this is not what it's about. It's actually about Jesus Christ. And I'm so glad that he wrote Ecclesiastes, because every once in a while, it is good for someone to sit down and read that from beginning to end.
Yeah, I like how the whole book ends. I quoted part of that passage, but I want to read from a verse or two back. He said, and this is, again, after his total evaluation of what is life all about? Why am I here? And over again, he says, vanity of vanities, or futility of futilities. All is futility. Anything you pursue on this earth ultimately will leave you empty, because there's a void that God is filling in us. In fact, Paul even alludes to it in Athens, and he talks about how he has created in us this desire to search for God. And James, I think that when people are looking for meaning, what they're really looking for is something bigger than themselves. And I promise you, nothing is big enough to fill the void that God placed in you other than God himself.
Well, you look at any arena, some actors, they pursue the Oscar. They that little magical moment where they're in front of everyone in the world, which most people don't watch Oscars anymore, but just to hold that little naked golden man and say, you love me, you really love me. And then once that moment is over, then what?
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? It was you pushed all that energy, all that focus for that one moment, and then it passes. What I love about Jesus and God is that if we make him our focus in the moment we want to obtain, it's a moment that isn't temporary, it's eternal. And when you die, you get to take your relationship with Jesus with you, and everything else passes away.
Yeah. So I'll go back, and I didn't read those verses. Let me read it again. It says, and this is the last few verses of Ecclesiastes. It says, by these, my son, be further warned. There is no end to the making of many books, and much study wearies the body. Now, you're not talking about studying spiritual things. He's basically saying you can learn all there is to know about the earth. You can become the mad scientist who totally focuses on some part of creation, trying to find some answer or purpose or meaning in it. You can study the stars. You can read all the books about success and health and wealth and all of those things. He says there's no end to this, and it makes the body weary. You can do it so often. But then he says, when the conclusion of the matter is heard, fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. God, because, and then he has a because in there. Why? Because God will bring every deed into judgment along with every hidden thing, whether good or evil. Now, that's not only a warning. That, to me, is an encouragement.
Yeah.
Because if you've pursued the right things to make one happy or successful or joyful, maybe a better word, then you're not going to be disappointed in the last day, because Christ fills all in all. And the pursuit of God gives you that meaning in life that you're looking for, because what you do now is about a bigger purpose than yourself. And I think that's what people miss when they're asking, what is the meaning of life?
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of reminded, I want to read a little section from 1 John chapter 3, starting at verse number 1. Is see what great love the Father has given to us, that we should be called God's children. And we are. The reason the world does not know us is that it didn't know him. Dear friends, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet been revealed. We know that when he appears, we will be like him, because we will see him as he is. And everyone who has hope in him purifies himself with that hope. And to me, that really sums up what the purpose of this life is all about, isn't it? It's striving to be in the family of God and recognize that being a child of God is not just some sort of concept and idea. It's who we are in Christ.
Oh, wow. So I'm going to tie that to Ephesians chapter 2, because when you talked about family, being a child of, there's a passage here that says, you are dead in your trespasses and sin. This is the first verse. You used to walk in them when you were conformed to the ways of this world and conformed to the ruler of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience. Hear all that, sons, children, father. All of these, all of us lived among them at one time. We fulfilled the cravings of our flesh and indulged in our desires and thoughts, and just like the rest, and here's how that verse ends, we were by nature children of wrath. Well, when we associate with Satan, when we try to find fulfillment or meaning in life through the things that are in the world, we naturally are becoming and living like children who are children of wrath. And you can't find meaning there. You can find some temporary, passing, fleeting comfort or joy, or happiness, but it's not the same.
Well, what I love about John and First John is he makes it so simple, because we can get caught up in all these different directions and say, well, he sought after this and he sought after this, and John says there's only two paths. And you pointed that out in Ephesians, 2 there. But let me read further in 1 John 3, verse 10. It says, "This is how God's children and the devil's children become obvious. Whoever does not do what is right is not of God, especially the one who does not love his brother or sister." And so what he's basically saying is, like, you want to know which path you're on? Because there's only two. You're either children of God or you're children of the devil. And how do you know? It's how you live your life.
Yeah. Do you think that when you become a child of God and you find the real meaning in life, which is this identification with Christ? I kind of put it like this. Show me someone who doesn't know who their earthly biological parents are. Yeah. And I think we even talked about this in a podcast not long ago. When they finally come to, many of them seek their own, their biological parents, because they feel like something is missing about who they really are at their core. And it changes how they see the world. It changes how they see themselves. If they're orphans, that have been, now they've been adopted and been raised by someone else, they always wonder, well, was I left because I wasn't good enough? Did they not love me? Is there something about me that is unlovable? I think that's where people are in the world before they find God. They don't have that those roots that give them this confidence that allow them to take the things that happen in life, good or bad, and contextually understand them. So I want to say it like this. The reason people, I think, seek to replace the spot in themselves that is reserved only for God, they pursue some earthly thing. They don't understand who they are, and therefore they don't know how to relate to those things. So I relate to something that I do for recreation or some business success or failure. I don't relate those and take those personal as though that's the core of who I am. To me, they are all changed by the lens through which I view them, and that's the lens of being a child of God.
Yeah. It's what you just said kind of reminded me of Romans 1, where there's only really two religions. You're either worshiping the Creator or you're worshiping the created.
Right.
Or the creature. And so whenever you start making what you do or some sort of physical thing who you are, that kind of tells you about who your God is. And that's what's so dangerous about that, right? So, what is the meaning of life is actually you identifying what your God is. Because if what you live for is anything other than God, then it's going to shape who you are. And you're going to become the child of that image for the rest of your life.
Wow. So in other words, no matter who your biological parents were, it's who you live your life with. It's going to shape your morals, your character, and give you a big sense of what your identity is. Yeah. And when Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, they broke this covenant with God, this very special relationship. And now God has been trying to bring us back and reintroduce us to Him and say, this is who you are. Yep. And so what's the purpose? What's the meaning of life? Well, it's not found in these earthly things. It's found at the core of who created you. Is that what we're saying?
That's right. Well, and that's why Paul refers to Jesus as the second Adam.
Yes.
It's because when sin came in, it corrupted us. It took us away from God's original intent for us. It actually, when sin came in, it was like it removed the meaning of life.
Yes, it did.
But before sin,
that's why we're so confused.
Adam and Eve were living in their purpose and their calling. Everything was clear. There was no confusion. There was nothing but focus and understanding of what was given. And then when sin came in, all that was corrupted. And so the whole point of Jesus is to restore us back to that. In fact, let me read a section here from 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Starting at verse 16 here, it says, "From now on, then we do not know one another from a worldly perspective. Even if we have known Christ from a worldly perspective, yet now we know Him in that way no longer. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away, and see, the new has come. Everything from God, who has reconciled us to himself through Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. So what is the point of our existence right now before he comes? Is to be reconciled back to God through Jesus Christ. And anyone who doesn't get on that wagon, so to speak, is losing, and they're accomplishing what the purpose of life is.
So if people are trying to get their mind wrapped around what's the meaning of life, in the Metheta study, there are several questions that are asked, and I want to read some of them and share them because I'd like for people to think about them. And so you and I are going to have probably together would have a different answer than maybe some people, probably most people who do not know Christ. So I want to try to have you and me today to put ourselves in the position of folks who maybe don't know Christ. So I'm going to put you in that position for a second here. And I want to ask you these questions. And if you didn't have Christ at the center of all that you do, when I know, how would you answer this? So the first one is, if you died today, looking back, what would you say the meaning of your life has been so far? Can you think of a time in your life when God wasn't at maybe the core, and you would have answered that differently than you would now?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think I would immediately try to start thinking about my accomplishments or...
Oh, there you go. Yep. First thing to come to mind.
Yeah. It's kind of like, well, what have I done? What have I accomplished? And, during certain times of my life, I think that I would have different focuses there. I used to be really big into art, and I won some art competitions. And so if you caught me in high school, I'd probably say, yeah, you see that? I got a silver award, or I got, whatever. You immediately start looking at your trophy cabinet, so to speak, So this, depending on where I was in my life, I think I would go to whatever trophies I had.
So one of the other questions, if you had, let's say you had died, car wreck or something tragic as a teenager, and they had come together for your funeral, what do you think most of the people would have been who stood up to speak at your funeral or to give the eulogy? What would do you think have been focused on to try to express who you were?
Yeah, it probably would have been, well, he was funny, quirky, and a good artist.
Yeah. I hear you. And you think about most people in the world, think about most adults, what are they going to be remembered for? And I've been to funerals where everything in the room was like, one guy was a cowboy that had died, and he, they had his saddle and pictures of his horse and pictures of the life being a cowboy. And that was who he was. His whole identity was wrapped up in that. And I remember, and I've been to a number of funerals like this, and I'd walk out and I'd tell my wife, whatever you do, if I die before you and you put my funeral together, there better not be one worldly thing surrounding me, because my life is not about, sport or playing a sport or an activity, or I love to play the guitar. I don't want any of that up there. Yeah. You make sure that people know that the only thing that mattered to me was God.
Well, that's a great way to kind of process things. If you look at your life, is there anything in here, especially as a Christian, from a Christian perspective, that you don't want brought up at your funeral?
Interesting.
You know what I'm saying? It's like, because I think every Christian would want to be remembered as one who really loved the Lord. Yeah. And if that's kind of a stretch, it's like, well, we know he really likes sports, and we know that he
also loved the Lord.
Yeah, and he also really is like, and he really loved cars.
Yeah.
And like,
and the Lord.
And the Lord. Like, the Lord is like an afterthought from anything. If you almost feel like that's almost what would happen, then you have to really reframe your life and say, do I need to cut some things off? Yeah. Do I need to cut off some things? Because I need to make sure that everyone knows what I'm about is Jesus Christ.
And that's my point.
Yeah.
When you ask the question, what is the meaning of life? Yeah. You have not arrived to understanding it until you finally hit that point where you say, you know what? I mean, I have these things I enjoy or like, or that I'm called to do. Nothing wrong with that. And by the way, if you choose to have a guitar sitting next to your casket, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing necessarily. I'm simply saying, what do you want to be known for? Yeah. And in the end, I just want to be known for and by the Lord.
That's right.
That is where meaning is. You can put me in a casket and I'll be as happy as I can be if I know that my spirit is with the Lord. Yeah. But you know what? I don't want to die and then have my ashes placed in the locker room of the Dallas Cowboys. That's not my passion, man.
Your ashes, buried under the Dallas Dome.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't want any of that stuff. And of course, being somewhat facetious, but this really cuts to the heart of, if you're trying to find the meaning of life and you're struggling and you feel empty and you feel out of touch, it's because you haven't put the only thing in the void. And every one of us have that void, by the way. You haven't put the right thing in the void. Everything else will leave you empty.
But that's a great question. Is what are you known for right now? Lets people know what life is to you.
Yes.
And what they the majority know you for is what they believe you have prioritized. And that's kind of a haunting thought.
It is. I don't know that most of us probably measure up to that. That, in other words, if people speak one word that describes James Graham, one passion. What is James Graham's greatest passion? If you just ask that, what is your greatest passion? What would people say?
Well, I mean, I hope it would be some level of Christian media would come up.
You know what I'm saying? Well, he loves the Lord, right?
So, I was like, if that would be it. But if something else came up, I would be a little worried, Like, for example, last several months I've been selling a lot of stuff on eBay for house purposes and family purposes. But if someone says, James is really good at eBay. It's like, and I'm glad I'm walking out of that season right now, because I don't want to stay in eBay, because there's a certain mindset that you have to and everything. It was tiresome for me. You know what I'm saying? It's not what I want to do.
Well, let's put it this way. Let's assume that someone came up to you and to me and look at me. Someone asked you about me, and they said, "Well, who's the most important woman in Mike's life?" I hope he wouldn't say, "Well, he really gets along with so and so that works with him." I hope he'd say it's his wife. I mean, there's no question.
His secretary.
Why would you even ask a crazy question like that? But who's the most important person in your life? It ought to be Jesus.
It ought to be seen, and ought to be known.
Seen and known.
And your wife should always know that she's second to Jesus, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, right. And there's a verse that says, I'm trying to think, it's Acts 4:13, when it's Peter and John, and it talks about they recognized them as having been with Jesus.
Yes, yeah.
That's the kind of thought.
And in Corinthians, I know a lot of scholars will get angry at me because no, Paul's only referring to himself and everything. But I want to read verse 20, because I think it's more than just apostleship. But it says, "Therefore we are ambassadors for Christ. Since God is making his appeal through us, we plead on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. He made the one who did not know sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." Now, I've heard people try to argue that's only a claim of an apostle. But I'm like, if that was only their purpose, then what's ours?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Even if it was a reference to the apostles, and it was in that context spoken to them directly, but you're right. The principle is identically the same.
Yeah, if I'm not supposed to be an ambassador of Christ, and that was just for the apostle, then what am I supposed to be an ambassador of?
Yes.
Right? So it doesn't make any sense. On principle, that is our calling. They were just the forerunners. They were the first ones to do it. And remember what he says, imitate me as I imitate the Lord. Mm-hmm. So that was his calling, then we're supposed to imitate that. Otherwise, we're not listening to the instructions of the apostles.
Yeah, that's right. So Paul said in Galatians 2:20, "I've been crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live." Now we're talking about the meaning of life. "Yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. So that the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." That's the meaning of life.
So you know what my purpose is in life, Mike? It's simple. I am supposed to be an ambassador for Christ. I'm supposed to represent Christ here on earth and guide people to be reconciled to God through him. That's my purpose. But you know what? Spoiler alert, that's your purpose. And everyone who's watching this podcast right now, you have the same purpose. The question is will you take it or not?
Yeah, boy, isn't that true? And so we now have this wonderful access to God through Jesus Christ. And in the study, and we didn't have time to go into it, but through the study today, if you'll take time to go to Methodist and study through this particular lesson, you're going to find that the emphasis of the lessons is to help you see that there's only one way to fill that void inside you that's making you ask the question, what's the meaning of life? There's one great thing that one of the greatest things Christianity has brought to me. I really don't ask that question anymore. So if you'd like to stop asking that annoying question, go find Christ. He'll fill the void. We'll see you next time.